You know, a protractor is a great way to measure angles. And you might have seen them, and I'm sure you're going to use them a lot at some point. Let's just take a look at my protractor, which is so fancy because you can actually read it, which is sort of neat. And let's see if we can actually measure some angles and use the protractor to measure angles. So here you can see various angles appearing. And the first one I want us to consider is to find the measure of angle BOD. The letter O is right here, and traditionally that center angle in this context is usually used with an O. So BOD. I'm looking at that angle right there, and I want to find the measure of it, and we measure that in degrees. How do I denote that? Here's how I denote it. I take the angle symbol, and I write BOD, and I'm going to measure it, and so I put an M in front, and that tells me that's the measure of this angle. So how many degrees is it? Well, the degrees are marked off here, and you can see this is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and this D is halfway between 60 degrees and 70 degrees, so it's 65 degrees. And so I write this as 65 degrees. And you'll notice that since that measure is actually less than 90 degrees, this angle is an example of an acute angle. It's an acute angle. Let's now find the angle, the measure of angle. So the measure of angle, you see I write that, measure of angle, and this one is going to be COD. Now let's take a look at where that is. COD. Okay, now that angle right there has some measure, and I want to see if I can figure out what it is. So how am I going to do that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here where all the angles begin to be measured, and I'm going to sweep out and find this entire measure of this entire angle. And then what I'll do is I'll subtract off this little piece right here. Notice that this entire angle is equal to this measure plus that measure. So here's what we say. We say that, and I'm going to write this over here. The measure of angle COB equals the measure of angle COD plus the measure of angle DOB. This entire angle is equal to that angle plus that angle. All right, now we know a lot of stuff, and so let's see if we can sort of put together all the stuff we know. What is the measure of angle COB? Well, I can read that off, and I see this is 120 degrees, this is 130 degrees, this is right between 130 and 140 degrees, so it's 135 degrees. So this quantity right here is 135 degrees. 135 degrees. And that's going to equal the sum of the angles, measure of angle COD plus this measure. But that measure is something that luckily we just figured out to be 65. So it's going to be equal to the measure of angle COD plus this angle, which we already figured out to be 65 degrees. So now I actually have an equation, and I want to solve this equation for the measure of this angle. So what do? Well, I'm going to undo the addition of 65 degrees by subtracting 65 degrees from each side. And when I do that, on this side, you see here, I get this part to 0. I just get the measure of angle COD. And that's going to equal, well, what is this length right here? That's 70 degrees. So this angle measure right in here turns out to be 70 degrees. Another example of an acute angle. Remember, an acute angle is any angle that's less than 90 degrees. If the angle is greater than 90 degrees, then we call it obtuse. Neat stuff.